The whole kingdom had mixed feelings about the just offered sacrifice. They didn't know whether to rejoice over the fact that they now had their warriors back for their defense, or they should be sad for the massive loss of humans' life they just had in the land. For 2 market days, women were not their usual selves, as they tried to observe mourning days for the family who had their maidens offered as sacrifice to the gods. They were very quiet and didn't go to visit themselves. They stayed indoors most of the time, and that made the whole kingdom look strange. The streets were so dry, even their pets didn't get much to eat outside their owners' homes. Children were not allowed to go out, as they were grounded from going anywhere outside their father's compound. At the end of the 2 market days, the villagers all marched to the palace to be a witness to the division of half the king's property amongst the families of the sacrificed virgin maidens. They wanted to make sure these families collected what they deserved as promised by the king. They got to the palace and called for the attention of the king. King Deja had already known the reason the people had called him out, so he had made prepare the properties he wanted to share amongst these people. The last thing he wanted would be to fail on his promise to the families of the deceased. He called one of his chiefs, who happened to be his right-hand man, to come witness the sharing of the properties. He arrived at the palace some minutes after he was called upon, and the king attended to the people outside his palace immediately. He shared his promised properties equally amongst them and left them with smiles on their faces. Finally, the women could get back to their normal works and live to remember the sacrifices of these virgin maidens. Since the coast was already clear enough for the warriors to pick up their swords and go for any battle that came their way, they decided to make a proposal to the king to revisit their abandoned plan to go capture the people of Egata kingdom for the work on the palace's farm. They gathered themselves together with their leader Balogun, marched down to the palace, and tendered their agreed discussion to the king. King Deja was skeptical about them going for any battle. He wasn't too sure they would come back safe this time. He knew the manipulations that took place between himself and the chief priest, so he had already concluded in his heart that the sacrifice was not accepted and the warriors not yet fit to go for war. But he couldn't just rule out their proposal, so he told them he would think about it and get back to them later. He wanted time to himself to be able to ask the chief priest if the sacrifice was accepted at all. He also wanted to know if the warriors would not lose their lives in the process. Although he was 100% sure that the sacrifice wasn't accepted, but he still wanted to hear from the horse's mouth. So he sent for the chief priest to leave whatever he was doing to come see him in the palace. The messenger left and was back in no time. He said the chief priest wasn't on seat and that he had traveled some days before he got there. He said he left the message for his son, who he met at the shrine, and he assured him he would have the message delivered to the chief priest.
3 days later, the chief priest went to the palace to see the king immediately he got back from his trip, as requested. He had known what the king wanted to discuss with him, so he demanded to see the king in his chambers. He was allowed in since he was the kingdom's chief priest and he had never made such requests before. He knocked and silently entered. King Deja was surprised to see him, as he wasn't aware he had got back from his trip. He sat him down and told him his fears about what the warriors had discussed with him days back. He further asked him if the last sacrifice they offered for the warriors' refortification and purification was truly accepted by the gods. The chief priest sighed and bowed his head in deep thought. He then explained to the king that the gods never accepted the sacrifice as they were not given all they requested for. He said they've spoken to him about the unfaithfulness and maneuvering he did with the king during the sacrifice, and they were very angry at him. He said the trip he embarked on days before then was because the gods were no longer communicating with him. They got pissed and gave him that as his punishment for taking the king's bribe. King Deja was shocked to hear this. He became so perplexed as he didn't know what punishment the gods had in store for him too. He believed the gods could do worse to him, considering he was not the closest person to them and the orchestrator of the whole thing. The chief priest advised the king to stop them from getting involved in any war, as they would all soon start struggling with their lives. The substance they took was still in them and would in no time wipe out the 2/3 of warriors that still had it in them. He suggested he told them himself, seeing that they always believed every word that came out of the chief priest's mouth. He wanted to tell them as if it were the gods who instructed him to pass the message to them. But King Deja said no. He was afraid the news of Omuaran's warrior being weak would fly out to the neighboring village again, and they would use that against him and his people. He also didn't want the villagers to start thinking he wasn't fit enough to become king, saying that he'd been battling with the same problem for 2 months. He then concluded he would allow them go to war against the Egata people, but he wouldn't follow them. He also had it in mind to announce the recruit of new warriors, so that the strong men who would want to benefit from the war proceeds would join the kingdom warriors. This was what he said. He said running the affairs of the kingdom few months to that time had taken a toll on him, and he didn't want to push himself to go for a war he wasn't prepared for. Considering his past record, it was easy to convince the warriors and Omuaran people that their king was just not fit to go to war. If only they had known the real reason the king decided to stay back this time, they would have also stayed back and waited for their prolonged, untimely death. They would at least have had the time to settle things and bid their families farewell before the substance they still had in them took their lives. But they didn't know. Hence, their eagerness to go and capture the Egata people. They got ready and headed for Egata kingdom in no time. The warriors going without planning for a long period of time would have been a good strategy to catch them unawares, and the capturing made easy by the unpreparedness of Egata warriors. But that wasn't a case, because the gods had left them and they were now vulnerable to attacks. Even their littlest enemies, who were probably not as strong as they were, would have overcome them should they fight against them. The Omuaran warriors boldly sojourned to Egata kingdom, holding their guns and machetes, unknowing to them that they were as empty as barrel. They attacked first and were taking hold of the whole kingdom until their organs started to malfunction and they could not as much as lift a finger by themselves anymore. They became so weak that their enemies noticed this, rose against them, and had it in mind to capture and enslave them too. But the warriors began to die by themselves even before they could think of fighting them any further. A lot of the warriors slumped and died. The only ones left were the ones that didn't partake in the dinner that led to their easy attack. They ran as fast as their legs could and went as far as their legs could take them until they got far away from Egata kingdom. The villagers and warriors were surprised at how the war turned out to be in their favor and thought it was their gods who helped them overcome the war. They have earlier heard of the sacrifice performed by the Omuaran warriors for their cleansing, so they didn't think what they had taken was still affecting them even while they were at war them.
The whole kingdom of Omuaran were sad as that would the first time of losing so many warriors to war. They were surprised they could lose that much warrior to a kingdom considered to be the smallest of all kingdoms around them. Some people rightly guessed that the gods were angry at them, while others said they lost to Egata kingdom because the king didn't follow them to that war. They believed that the king had the favor of the gods upon him, and they would have all been saved from death if the king had followed them. Things continued to deteriorate for the people of Omuaran. They no longer reaped bountiful harvest. They had problems going out of the village as they were usually attacked by strange figures. The youth easily died at the slightest illness they had. They no longer felt the hand of the gods in their lives, farm proceeds and daily activities. All these were still ongoing when King Deja went ahead to make an announcement that he had found the love of his life, whom he wanted to make his third wife. He had married a maiden given to him by the village head hunter, all in the bid to appreciate the king for helping the hunter out with their hunting by equipping them and showing interest in what they did.
He accepted the maiden without hesitation and saw marrying her as acquiring another sexual asset. He had her things packed to the palace immediately she was handed to him, few months before trouble loomed the kingdom. He was going to marry another maiden again, and this time a non-indigenous. He had met that maiden on one of evening strolls round the village, while the warriors were at war against the Egata kingdom. He saw her and was attracted to her beauty. The maiden was indeed beautiful, but wasn't looking ordinary to myself and the whole village. I guess the only one that didn't see this, or rather refused to see this, was King Deja. He was carried away by her incomparable beauty and immediately approached her for marriage. The maiden was also swept off her feet by the handsomeness of the king. She was not a native of Omuaran kingdom, so she had never seen a king that young and handsome. She was so drawn to the king and could think of nothing else but accepting the king's marriage proposal. She accepted to marry the king almost immediately he asked her to, and that made the king so happy that he didn't even see it as improper to announce his marriage to some maiden from elsewhere at that critical moment. King Deja invited his chiefs and told them about his plans to marry Ewan, his queen-to-be, and asked them to go to Ewa's place to do the needful. He said they should go pay her bride price, assist her in packing her things, and lead her down to the palace for the completion of the marriage ritual. The chiefs couldn't object the king's desire because they had no voice when it comes to telling the king what to do and what not to do. The chiefs obeyed and did as the king had instructed them. They went to see Ewa's people with all that was required to pay her bride price. They went with the king's staff of authority, which was to represent the king's presence and awareness. They didn't meet Ewa's mother at home when they got there, but they met her sister, who had been doing a lot of things for Ewa in the absence of her mother. Ewa's mother was not always at home to take care of her child like a mother should because of the nature of her job. The woman who served as Ewa's mother gave the chiefs a warm welcome together with a couple of uncles from their side. They accepted all the chiefs had brought along with them and gave Ewa to them as the new bride of the king. They ate, drank, and appreciated their new in-laws as they left with Ewa and the guards carrying all her belongings for her.